Howdy! Welcome to Aspire Mountain Academy. I'm Professor Curtis, your instructor for this course in Introductory Statistics. In less than 10 minutes, this video explains a simple pattern for sharing conclusions from a hypothesis test. Let's get started. Oftentimes in the real world, you're going to need to translate the results of your hypothesis test, or just any statistical analysis in general, into language that other people can understand. And this is especially true with decision makers because they're waiting on the results of your statistical analysis so that those results can inform a decision that they need to make. But it's not going to do much good for them if all you tell them is, well, we rejected H0. Yeah, that's not going to go over too well because, again, they don't understand that language. So you've got to be able to translate the results of the hypothesis test into language that other people can understand. So the proper wording that should be used, and keep in mind that what we're calling proper wording is coming from the author of your textbook, who is a pure statistician. So he's going to be very precise with the language that he uses. This is one area that really confuses a lot of students, but you don't need to be confused because here in a moment, I'm going to share with you a simple pattern for getting that precise wording that the author of your textbook is looking for. If you reject H0 in a one-tailed test, you could say there is sufficient evidence to support the claim. If you fail to reject H0 in a one-tailed test, you could say there's not sufficient evidence to support the claim. If you reject H0 in a two-tailed test, you could say there is sufficient evidence to warrant rejection of the claim. Or if you fail to reject H0 in a two-tailed test, you could say there is not sufficient evidence to warrant rejection of the claim. This is the language the author of your textbook wants to use. Presented this way, most students don't know, what to make out of all of this. But there's a pattern here. There's a method behind this madness. You don't need to understand it all. All you need to understand is the pattern. When you understand the pattern, you could go back to the previous example we've been using in several mini lectures about the XORT method that's claimed to, produce more girls than boys. And so for that hypothesis test that we were looking at earlier, you could say there is not sufficient evidence to support the claim that with the XORT method, the proportion of girls is greater than the 50% that occurs without treatment. So what is this pattern that I'm talking about here? I mean, if you're having a hard time getting your brain around what's going on, the simple pattern that I'm about to explain can help you navigate through these waters. So first, we got to understand there's a condition that's coming out of our hypothesis test. The result could be that we reject the null hypothesis or we fail to reject the null hypothesis. We're going to have one of those two results. So there's a statement that we're going to make depending upon which of those two conditions we have for our hypothesis test. If we reject the null hypothesis, we're going to use the language, there is sufficient evidence. If we fail to reject the null hypothesis, then we're going to say that there is not sufficient evidence. So that's the first piece of the statement that we need to make. There either is or is not sufficient evidence, and it's directly tied to whether we reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis. Now, another condition that we could have with our hypothesis test is with the type of test that we have. So we could have a one-tailed test or we could have a two-tailed test. And there's specific language tied to each of those conditions as well. So the second part of our conclusion is going to come from one of these two conditions. If we have a one-tailed test, then we're going to say to support the claim. If we have a two-tailed test, then we're going to say to warrant rejection of the claim or to reject the claim. So it's pretty straightforward. And we know that we have a one-tailed test or a two-tailed test simply by looking at the alternative hypothesis. Not the claim, but the alternative hypothesis. Because remember, sometimes the claim doesn't always match the alternative hypothesis. So you want to look at the alternative hypothesis to know whether you have a one-tailed test or a two-tailed test. If your alternative hypothesis has a greater than sign or less than sign, then you know you're going to have a one-tailed test. And then the language you're going to use in your conclusionary statement is going to be to support the claim. If you have a not equal to sign in your alternative hypothesis, then that means you have a two-tailed test, and you're going to say warrant rejection of the claim. Let's take a look at how this pattern is applied. And we're going to use that previous example, the XOR method that we've been using in previous mini lectures, to show you how this is done. So the conditions we had from that hypothesis test was we failed to reject the null hypothesis, and we had a one-tailed test. So from that we know we're going to say there's not sufficient evidence, and we're going to say that we're going to support the claim. So then how do we piece this together? Well, it goes just like this. There is not sufficient evidence to support the claim that with the XOR method, the proportion of girls is greater than the 50% that occurs without treatment. So there's three pieces that we need to put together for our conclusionary statement. Okay? So notice how the first part comes from whether or not we reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis. The second part comes from the type of test we're running, whether it's a one-tailed test or a two-tailed test. And then the final part is simply a restatement of the claim itself. These are the three pieces you want to put together, and you put them together in this order. So once you understand the pattern that you saw on the previous slide, then you can get through this pretty simple. So I highly recommend that you go back to that slide and you write that pattern down, put it in flashcards, whatever you need to do to memorize it and get it in your head. Because once you have that known and down, then it's going to be a lot simpler to come out with these conclusionary statements. There's some considerations we need to make here with concluding hypothesis tests. First of all, as we just started out the lecture with, you never want to say things like reject the null hypothesis. Okay? People don't understand that language, so you always want to make sense of the conclusion in language that they understand. And most people can understand this precise language that the author of your textbook was, purporting out there. So, that pattern that I just got done explaining, that's what you really want to use, because that puts it in language that most people can understand. Realize that some statistics resources out there, they like to use phrases like accept the null hypothesis. Technically, that's not really correct. They use phrases like this because they think it helps some students understand the concept of hypothesis testing better. And indeed, for some students it may, but that language is not technically correct. To say we accept the null hypothesis means we're proving it, and that's not what we're doing. Our methodology assumes already from the start that the null hypothesis is true. So we're not trying to prove anything with it. We're just trying to see if we have enough evidence to reject it. And if we don't, then we just fail to reject it. That's all we're doing. Fail to reject the null hypothesis is much more correct than accept the null hypothesis, because fail to reject the null hypothesis says the available evidence is not strong enough to reject the null hypothesis. And that's really what we're doing. So we're based on the assumption that the null hypothesis is already true, and we're proceeding with that assumption in mind. And that brings us to the end of this mini lecture. I hope you found it helpful. You can find more mini lectures for this and other courses at AspireMountainAcademy.com. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.